Hello, and welcome to the next part of our Chapter a Day series working through the book of Genesis. If you've been with us on this journey, we've seen how God has been revealing himself through the story of the creation of the universe, the creation of human beings, through the story of humanity's rebellion against God, turning away from him, and God's revealing of his plan and his promise to the nations. We've been following a family from Haran when God called a man and his wife out of everything they knew, telling them that he was going to bring them to a land that only he could show them, and how he was going to bless them, and how he was going to bless their descendants, and that they would grow into a great nation. How everyone who blessed this nation would be blessed, and everyone who dishonored this nation would be cursed, and how through them all the nations of the world would be blessed. We followed Abram, who God would change his name to Abraham, and his wife Sarai, who could not have children, changing her name to Sarah, and that she would have a child. And they had Isaac. We followed the journey of Isaac and his wife Rebekah, to Jacob and Esau, and then following Jacob's life with his wives and the children he had, to Joseph. And Joseph is where we find ourselves today, and we saw how Joseph went from being a young man who was the favorite of his father, the favorite in his household, to coming to the point where he was despised by his brothers, to such an extent that his brothers wanted to take his life. Only through the intervention of his oldest brother, Reuben, was he spared being killed. But then how the other brothers sold him into slavery into Egypt to get rid of him, to remove him forever from the promises and the dreams God had given him. How he ended up in Egypt, and God blessed him in Egypt, and though a slave, he had success. But then when he sought to act honorably to his master and honorable to his God, the results, rather than favor, was accusation and punishment. We find Joseph in prison now, in the prison house where those awaiting execution were kept. But the Lord is with him even in the midst of the prison. So let's pick up the story where we find that Joseph has been given the special role of being the one who cares for the prisoners in the heart of the prison. Chapter 40. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. So we meet these two individuals in the story. We have the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. And we're told that the king of Egypt had two of his senior servants, his chief cupbearer and his chief baker. These two men both would be responsible for the protection and care of the king. The chief baker would oversee the food preparations for the king and ensure that nothing was tampered with and everything met the king's needs. The chief cupbearer would serve both as the one who protected the king's drinks, his beverages, to make sure nothing was given to the king that could harm him, but oftentimes the cupbearer also served as an unofficial advisor and support for the king. These two men, we're told, do something that causes great offense. And as a result, they are thrown into the heart of the prison. And Joseph, as a servant serving in the prison, he's a prisoner, but he also works in the prison, has been given the responsibility of attending to these two very important prisoners. So that is where we see Joseph in prison now caring for these two men. And we're told that some time passes. And then we see the Lord's hand at work. And one night, verse 5, they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked the Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So we have these two men, and they both had a dream. In ancient Near Eastern culture, dreams carried significance. Now, even in those days, they had an understanding that you'd have the predictable dream, simply reliving an event of the day or something like that. But when a dream didn't fit the regular, it was considered to be significant, that it had a particular meaning, that it was prophetic in nature. And so they're wondering about their dreams because they feel they are significant. Now think too where these two men are. They are in prison. So they have a bizarre dream. Each of them on the same night have a bizarre dream. They're not the same dream. They are looking for any sign of what's going to happen to them because right now, because they've caused an offense to the king, which must have been significant, here they are in the heart of the prison, generally where those wait for their execution. And suddenly they have this dream, but there's no one to interpret it, no soothsayer, no Egyptian priest that could give them advice. There's just the servant Joseph. But Joseph makes an important statement. Joseph references God. He says God is the one who understands and explains dreams. So we have the sense that Joseph is now going to call upon God to give him the answer to these dreams. So the first one, the cupbearer, shares his dream. He says, okay, this was my dream. I dreamt there was this vine, and the vine had 3 branches. And as I'm with this vine, the branches all start to blossom. And they quickly blossom, and the blossoms turn to fruit, and soon there are these luscious clusters of grapes, these 3 clusters of grapes. And I reach out my hand, and I take the clusters of grapes, and they're good. And suddenly I'm squeezing them over the cup of Pharaoh, and the cup is in Pharaoh's hand. That's the dream I've had. What does it mean? And so Joseph says to him, well, your dream, the 3 branches which produce 3 sets of blossoms, which produce 3 clusters of grapes, this refers to 3 days. And he said, you picking these clusters of grapes, and next thing you know, you're squeezing them over the cup of Pharaoh that is in his hand. This is saying that you are going to be restored. You're going to go back to being the cupbearer of the king. So in 3 days, he is going to lift you up and put you back to where you were before. And then Joseph says, when you do that, when you're back in this privileged position with the king of Egypt, please remember me. I was stolen from my homeland and forced here as a slave. And then even here, I'm in prison for something I didn't commit. So please tell Pharaoh about what happened to me. Well, the baker, hearing the positive interpretation of the dream that's just been given, says, well, here's my dream. He says, I had a dream that I had these 3 baskets stacked on top of one another on my head. And the top basket is full of bread, and I'm carrying these baskets of bread, except birds keep flying down and grabbing the bread and stealing it from the basket. What does that mean? I'm sure this was hard for Joseph. As he explains, he said those 3 baskets also refer to 3 days. said, but in 3 days, the birds stealing the bread out of the basket, that is a picture of your execution. In 3 days, Pharaoh is going to call you up as well, but he's going to call you up so that he can take your head off and hang your body on a tree that'll become food for the birds of prey, for the scavengers. I'm sure that was crushing for the baker. Just as the cupbearer is probably thinking, oh, 3 days. In 3 days I'm going to be out of here. The baker's going, oh, please don't let it be true. Please don't let anything happen in 3 days. Make this young guy not know what he's talking about. But we're told that 3 days later, the king of Egypt, as we'll read, on the 3rd day, verse 20, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. So 3 days later, it's the Pharaoh's birthday, and as part of his celebration feast, he brings all his officials, all his servants gathered together. And he calls to the guards to go to the prison and bring back these 2 very important officials. So all the people know that where these guys have been, that they've been in prison because of an offense that they had done to Pharaoh. And suddenly they're brought out of the prison, and there they are in the presence of the king, in the presence of all these servants. And the king goes and he reinstates the baker. He reinstates the cupbearer. Verse 21, he restored the cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. So whether this is intended at this feast day as a picture of mercy, suddenly this man who was in an elevated position, who was put in prison, is now back in his position again. But there's the baker. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them, taking off his head, hanging his body as a sign to all those who would think for a moment that they could get away with offending the king. That the king can execute judgment. So we look at this and we see, well, here's Joseph. Joseph who trusted and depended on God. We see these 2 men who have this dream because God knows the mind of the king. Even before the king has made up his mind, God knows what the king would do in 3 days' time. Joseph, depending on God, gets the word from God to explain these dreams. And he explains them, and he's right. Imagine as these 2 men are there on the 3rd day, called out of prison. One with expectation, one with fear. His expectations are realized. His fears and dreads are realized. Now here's this chief cupbearer. He's seeing it all being played out just as Joseph told him. Joseph depending on God. And we read the story, and if we're not familiar with it, we think this is the moment where Joseph's fortunes change. This is the moment where things are made right. This is the moment where God sets Joseph back on the path that will meet those dreams. Those dreams he was given as a young man of an important and significant position. But that's not what happens. Not in this chapter. Verse 23, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. In all likelihood, there's 2 things happening here. First of all, the chief cupbearer is now back safely in his position, and he may be thinking he doesn't want to make waves right now. He doesn't want to talk about, well, there's this Hebrew down in prison, and he interpreted the dream for me. He doesn't want to talk about any of that, possibly. Maybe that's his thinking. He's just so thankful to be back in his spot. He's not going to ask any favors. He's not going to do anything. Maybe he thinks that good fortune has looked out for him, and he owes the young man in prison nothing, now that he is of an important status. All we do know is as time passes he forgets. Joseph remains in prison. This is one of those parts of the story where we have to consider God's timing. Because we look at this story and our thought is, God, this is perfect timing. Those bad things have happened to him, but now there's an opportunity. You've set it up. You've created it, God. You've given this opportunity. You gave the dreams. You knew what the future would hold. Joseph, depending on you, interprets it all correctly. This is what's going to happen. Things are going to change. And when they don't, then we are faced with the question, do we still trust God? Do we trust his promises? Do we trust his timing? Again, when the physical circumstances do not support the promise. When the physical circumstances do not support the promise, do we trust God? If you've been following with us, you know how this journey has gone. When God tells Abram that he and Sarai are going to have a child, the beginning of all their descendants that would come, that soon would be greater than the sand on the seashore, greater than the stars in the sky, greater than the dust, if it could be numbered. And yet, in the text, when we meet Sarai for the very first time, the only thing we're told about her, other than her relationship to Abram, is that she can't have children. And for 25 years, God keeps repeating and increasing and expanding and deepening the promise. But for 25 years, this couple gets older and older without children in the way God intended. We always need to learn the lesson that God can be trusted in his promises in his time. For Joseph, I don't know if on that third day when those men were called out, if Joseph for the next few days to come, every time somebody entered the prison, Joseph saying, this is it. They're coming for me. The chief bakers told them about me. Pharaoh wants to hear from me. They're going to let me go home, or they're at least going to forgive the charges made against me. They're going to at least give me an audience so I can say what really happened. But people come and people go, and nobody comes for Joseph in prison. Day by day, he does his chores. He's a prisoner. Nobody comes for Joseph in prison. But he trusts God. He's holding to the promise. And he's learning God's timing. We need to learn God's timing. That he is not slack according to his promises. He is not slack according to his plans. But he wants us to trust him. Even when the physical circumstances, even though when the reality around us seems so in opposition to what's been promised. He wants us to trust him. We need to trust him because he is the Lord. And as we've seen already in Genesis, faithful again and again and again to his promises. Meditate on that, I encourage you this week as you reread through these chapters. And if this has blessed you or encouraged you, let us know about it. Share it with somebody else. And continue with us as we follow this journey with Joseph. Thank you, and God bless you.